This is some portions from Iqbal, my father, written in English. A year or so before I was born, father visited the mausoleum of Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi, also known as Mujaddad al-Afsani. At the mausoleum, my father prayed for a child, a son, whom he could bring up in accordance with his own ideals of religion and morality. If God did grant him a son, he promised the saint that he would one day bring him to the mausoleum. His prayer was heard, and later in the summer of 1934, when I had attained an impressionable age, he took me to Sarhind. I could recollect our visit to the mausoleum of Sheikh Ahmad, for it is impressed vividly on my mind. Father took me inside the mausoleum, sat close to the grave of the saint, and recited the Quran. I felt afraid of the darkness and was terrified by the grave. Yet I was aware of a peculiar familiarity with my hushed and desolate surroundings. I watched Father recite the Quran. His sad voice vibrated through the dark dome of the mausoleum, and tears streamed down his cheeks. After staying at Sarhind for a day or two, we returned to Lahore, but I could never discover the purpose for our visit to the mausoleum and the reason for the tears streaming down Father's cheeks. It was the first time I had seen Father weep. I well remember how these questions bothered me in my childhood. Father rarely gave me an opportunity to judge how much affection and love he felt for me. He seldom held me close or kissed me, and because of this I never really felt the warmth of fatherly affection. Apparently he gave the impression of being a taciturn and rather cold man. When he saw me running about the house, he would smile faintly, as if someone was forcing him to smile. But frequently I noticed him sitting alone in an easy chair with his eyes closed, absorbed in his own thoughts. It would be wrong to conclude that he was incapable of loving or bestowing affection. Although his love for me was devoid of youthful vigor, it had the depth of maturity. I was, as it were, not only his son, but the younger generation of Islam personified. Parents sometimes disagree as to how their children are to be brought up. I was a frequent cause of disagreement between my father and mother. Mother thought that unless she fed me with her own hands, I would remain undernourished. But father maintained that she was spoiling me. His stunning instructions were that I should always feed myself. The instructions were, of course, carried out, but sometimes mother fed me stealthily, and if father happened to discover our little conspiracy, he smiled knowingly. Although mother was very strict and punished me if I was mischievous, father's rebuke always proved a better corrective. On very few occasions did father beat me. The reasons usually were rudeness to the servants, which he resented most, or running about barefooted in the summer sun. One rule that father was strict about was silence in our house. Sometimes when I played with other children on the lawn, he would order us to play elsewhere. But at other times he would join us in our games. When I was flying a kite, he occasionally appeared on the roof and took the string from my hand. Perhaps kite flying reminded him of his own childhood. As a child, I was very fond of painting. My father was not aware of my interest. When he learnt that I liked painting and saw a few of my works of art, he encouraged me a great deal and purchased large prints by French, Italian, and Spanish masters for me. I was also very fond of music, but he had neither a gramophone nor a radio in the house. Despite this lack, father too enjoyed music and even played his sitar before he went abroad for higher studies. His love for music never died. In the later phase of his life, Fakir Najmuddin, one of his friends, occasionally played the sitar or taus for him. Whenever a singer came to our house and sang some of his ghazals, father sent for me. In 1931, when father went to England to attend the Round Table Conference, I was about 7 years old. I wrote a letter asking him to bring me a gramophone. A gramophone never arrived, but my letter moved him to write the following poem to Javid, receiving his first letter. Mother's constant concern was that father did not do any work. I too used to wonder what he really did. If anyone asked me about the nature of his occupation, I felt embarrassed. Mother was anxious that we should build a house of our own. In those days, we used to live in a rented house on the McLeod Road. By May 1935, mother's wish was fulfilled and we moved to the new house. Tragically, on the third day after our arrival in the house, mother died. I was then about 11 years old and Munira, my sister, about 5. After mother's death, Munira and I drew closer to father. Rather how the two of us wept bitterly while because of our mother's death, and holding each other's hand, we both went to our father's room. He was as usual lying on bed, as he was not in good health at that time. He had also lost his voice and could not speak clearly. Munira and I stood at the door of his room, not knowing what to do. He noticed us and asked us to come closer. When we came near him, he motioned for us to sit on his right and left sides. Then, placing his hands affectionately on our shoulders, he said rather angrily to me, "You must not cry like this. Remember, you are a man, and men do not cry." He then kissed both of us on the forehead, probably for the first time in his life. The following March in 1936, father took me to Bhopal with him. In Bhopal, most of my time was spent in his company. He took a keen interest in my upbringing, being extremely particular about table manners. Since I was temperamentally shy, he told me repeatedly that I should not remain silent or self-possessed in company, but should talk to people. On our way back home in April, we stayed in Delhi for a few days. There he took me to a sightseeing trip. We visited the Red Fort, the tomb of Nizamuddin Auliya, and the Qutb Minar. When I asked him to take me up the Qutb Minar, father expressed his inability to climb. However, he allowed me to go up, admonishing, "Only do not look down from that height, otherwise you will feel frightened." As the years passed, father's life became very inactive because of chronic liver problem. During the summer, father slept in the courtyard at night. My bed was close to his, and sometimes I woke up in the dead of night and saw him sitting up in bed with his head rested on his knees. It was during the night that he had attacks of pain. And also, when inspiration came to him, the color of his face changed and he gave the impression of suffering from great physical discomfort. During the late hours of the night, he frequently called Ali Baksh, his servant, by clapping his hands and told him to bring his pen and notebook. As he wrote verses in his notebook, his face relaxed as if he had been relieved of great pain. Soon afterwards, he felt fast asleep as if nothing had happened. On numerous occasions, I saw father smiling or weeping without apparent cause. Alone he recited his verses for personal stimulation, raising his hand in the air and then letting it fall. He usually slept on the right side with his arm placed under the pillow. Sometimes, while lying in that position, he would shake one of his feet, indicating that he was not asleep but was thinking. When he was sound asleep, however, he would snore loudly. He rarely missed the morning prayers. His prayer mat was spread on a wooden divan lying by the courtyard. Extremely simple in his habits, Father wore a turban and a vest and covered his head with a towel when offering his prayers. His room was packed with books which were scattered all around him. He hated going out but loved to sit on his sofa or recline in his bed reading or taking notes. Sometimes he was so absorbed in reading that he forgot whether he had eaten his meals or not. On finishing the book, he would raise his head and ask Ali Baksh innocently, "Well, have I had my meals?" In the evening, he walked up and down the courtyard of our house. Besides this, he had no other physical activity, and his life appeared static. After mother's death, father gave up dyeing his hair. One day I called to his attention that his hair needed dyeing. He smiled and said, "I am an old man now." But I replied, "We want to see you young, father." He recommenced tinting his hair, but after a few months gave it up, and I never found another opportunity to ask him to begin again. Father looked terribly disturbed whenever he learned that Munira and I had quarreled. He would not bear to see us fighting with each other. If I were ever harsh to her, he became very upset and sordid and scolded me. "You really are a stone-hearted fellow. Have you no sensitivity? Don't you realize that she is the only friend you have in this world? Your mother is already dead, and so shall I die when my time comes. What would you be left with except her? If you quarreled with her, you would be the loneliest of men. And I tell you that it is not very pleasant to be lonely in this world." One of his friends, a Saudi Arab, used to visit him and occasionally recited passages from the Quran for him. The Arab had a lovely voice, and whenever he recited the Quran, father sent for me and made me sit close to him. Once the Arab recited Surah Al-Muzammil, and father was extremely moved. When the Arab had finished, father raised his head and said to me, "This is how I would like you to recite the Quran." On another occasion, he asked me to recite from Musaddas-e Hali. Someone sitting in the room pointed out that I should recite the verses about the Prophet Muhammad, which ran thus, "The one called mercy among the prophets." Before the second verse could be uttered, father was moved to tears. But there were times when he too would recite. He narrated stories from Islamic history, frequently talking about the Caliph Umar and Khalid bin Walid. He told me that the ancestors of Napoleon originally hailed from Arabia and that the Arabs had shown Vasco da Gama the route to India. Sometime in 1937, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, came to visit father. I entered the sitting room to ask for his autograph. The Quaid-e-Azam graciously obliged. I remember his asking me if I also wrote poetry. When I answered in the negative, he again asked, "Then what are you going to do? What do you intend to do when you grow up?" I did not know what to say and therefore stood mute. He turned to father and smilingly said, "He doesn't answer." "He wouldn't," replied my father, "because he is waiting for the day when you would tell him what to do." In his later years, father's eyesight grew very weak. Therefore, I read the newspapers to him every day. Every night I recited his own poems or halis to him. if I ever mispronounced a word, or he became angry. The slightest error in recitation would irritate him. Is it poetry or prose that you are reciting? He would snap. Many friends and admirers used to call on father, usually in the evening. Chairs were placed around his bed. He loved to chat with his friends while smoking his hookah. He was not in the habit of taking evening meals, only 1 or 2 cups of Kashmiri tea. I had strict instructions to be present when father had company, although listening to the grown-ups was an ordeal for me. I stole out of his room whenever I found an opportunity. This usually hurt him very much, and he would complain to his friends, I do not know why this boy shuns my company. During this phase of his life, he was haunted by a peculiar sense of loneliness, frequently lamenting, I spend the whole day of my life lying here as if I were a stranger. No one comes and sits with me. अब तो खत्म होने वाला
और सर दूसरी आपसे रिक्वेस्ट है थोड़ा सा कैमरे को भी एड्रेस कर दिया करें दरमियान
अच्छा
ताकि चलिए रिकॉर्डिंग
On his last night, April 2021, 1938, he lay on a bed in the sitting room, surrounded by his friends and admirers. It was about 9 p.m. when I entered the room. Who is it? He asked, since he could not recognize me. I'm Javid, I replied. He broke into a smile and said, I will only believe it when you really become Javid. Javid actually means eternity. Then he turned to one of his friends, Chaudhry Muhammad Hussain, and asked, Chaudhry Sahib, please see to it that he learns the prayer entitled Address to Javid, which appears towards the end of my Javid Nama. That night, there were anxious whisperings everywhere in the house. For the doctors had warned that father had only a few hours to live. He was spitting blood, and his condition had certainly taken a very dangerous turn. Although the doctor's opinion had been concealed from him, father knew that his end was near. Nevertheless, he was cheerful and full of humor, much more than he normally used to be. I too was not told about the seriousness of father's illness. I retired to my room and went to sleep. At dawn, I felt the hands of Ali Baksh shake me as he shouted, Come, get up, see what has happened to your father. I did not really believe he was dead. I got out of the bed only so that I could see what had happened to him. While proceeding to his room, I passed through the adjoining one and noticed Munira sitting alone on a divan. She had covered her face with her hands and was crying bitterly. As soon as she saw me going in the direction of father's room, she leapt towards me and grabbed my arm. Clinging to me, she tried to walk, but her feet staggered. We stood at the door of father's room and peeked inside. There was no one in his room. The windows were open and he was lying straight on his bed. A white sheet covered him up to his neck. His eyes were shut and his face was turned towards the west. His mustache had turned completely grey, but the edges of his hair on his head still retained the faded blackness of the dye he had used months ago for the last time at my request. Still clutching to my arm, her legs shaking, Munira sobbed and cried. In spite of my best efforts, I could not weep. I was afraid that if I had a tear, he would If I shed tear, he would rise suddenly, ask us to come closer, and when I had come near him, he would make the two of us sit on his right and left sides. Then, placing his hands affectionately on our shoulders, he would say rather angrily to me, "You must not cry like this. Remember, you are a man, and men do not cry." I came to know and love Father as I grew up, like many others of my generation. He infused a new spirit in the Muslims by constantly goading them to passionate action instead of scholastic quibbling. Today, he is a living force in the minds of sensitive Pakistanis, inspiring, directing, and sustaining us in our struggle to reconstruct our national life.